For 75 years, U.S. UFO files have changed as the technology behind the evidence changed. That is the rule for this story: file before folklore. A government document proves that a report, interview, image, as analysis, or investigation existed. It does not automatically prove that the object described inside it was extraordinary. A pilot can be completely sincere and still misjudge distance. A photograph can be authentic and still lack enough information to identify what it shows. A radar return can be real while the cause remains ordinary. So keep 4 categories in mind. A primary record tells us what an agency actually collected or wrote. A witness statement tells us what a person said they saw. Later analysis tells us what investigators concluded after more data or better methods became available. Unresolved means the available evidence still does not support a competent identification. That distinction matters because the archive itself has changed. The National Archives holds Air Force UFO files beginning in 1947, along with administrative records, photographs, motion picture films, and sound recordings. The collection is not a single folder marked UFO. It spans case files, Office of Special Investigations material, 94 microfilm rolls, thousands of photographs, and dedicated film and audio holdings. By the end of Project Blue Book, the Air Force said it had received 12,618 sightings. 701 remained classified as unidentified. That means more than 11,900 reports had received some form of identification or disposition before the program ended. Those numbers sound dramatic until you ask the next question. Unidentified by what method? Using what instruments? With what information available at the time? In 1947, the system was built around typed reports, phone calls, newspaper clippings, military interviews, and visual observation. By the 1950s, analysts were comparing photographs, film, radar, and intelligence reports. By the modern era, some cases arrived as infrared video, sensor tracks, telemetry, and multi-source intelligence. The mystery did not simply accumulate for 75 years. The standard of evidence kept moving. The archive also moved from one agency context to another, from Air Force technical intelligence to modern all-domain analysis. A case that looked difficult in 1952 can sometimes be easy today because we know about a classified aircraft, a satellite constellation, a launch record, or a sensor artifact that the original investigator could not test. And the first files show how quickly the government learned that a strange report could be both real and incomplete. In the summer of 1947, the phrase flying discs moved from newspaper language into military paperwork. The label was descriptive before it became ideological. It could refer to a circular object, a bright light, or simply something an observer could not match to a known aircraft. The Air Force records now preserved at the National Archives contain case material beginning in June of that year. What followed was not one giant investigation. It was a growing bureaucracy trying to answer a basic defense question. Were these reports mistakes, foreign technology, secret American projects, natural phenomena, or something else? The early record is messy because the reporting system was messy. A sighting could begin with a civilian statement, pass through a local military office, be summarized again by intelligence personnel, and reach headquarters after details had already been compressed. Some files contain sketches, others contain second-hand descriptions, a few preserve photographs or film. The existence of the paper trail is solid. The precision of the observation often is not. Roswell is a useful warning about how easily those two things get confused. The National Archives says its Project Blue Book holdings contain no documentation discussing the 1947 Roswell incident. Decades later, an Air Force review concluded that the recovered material was consistent with a balloon system used by the classified Project Mogul program and found no record supporting recovered alien bodies or extraterrestrial material. Whatever someone believes about later testimony, the archival claim has to be stated exactly. The Blue Book collection itself is not a Roswell proof file. At the same time, military concern about unusual aerial reports was genuine. The Air Force did not need an extraterrestrial hypothesis to take them seriously. Anything unknown in controlled airspace could matter during the first years of the Cold War. Soviet aircraft, balloons, its experimental weapons, misidentified American systems, and bad reporting could all create the same operational problem. An observer sees something, cannot identify it, and sends the uncertainty upward. That is why the early files matter more than the mythology built around them. They show the government learning how to classify uncertainty. By December 1947, Air Materiel Command leadership had pushed the problem into a formal technical intelligence track. In January 1948, the effort that became Project Sign was assigned to the Technical Intelligence Division and was confirmed by technical instruction the following month. That sequence matters because it shows the Air Force was not merely collecting sensational stories. It was routing them through the same kind of organization used to evaluate possible foreign or unfamiliar technology. By late 1947 and early 1948, that uncertainty was formal enough to receive a project structure. The effort that became Project Sign was assigned to Air Materiel Command's Technical Intelligence Apparatus in January 1948 and formally confirmed the following month. It was later redesignated Project Grudge in 1949, then Project Blue Book in 1952. The names changed, but the core problem stayed the same. The collection system also had no modern universal reporting form, no smartphone metadata, no automated weather history attached to every sighting, and no global database of aircraft and satellites available to an investigator in seconds. A detailed statement could still arrive without the one measurement needed to test it. The core problem stayed the same. Investigators were trying to turn reports from human observers into technical judgments. And within 2 years of the first flying disc wave, some of the most sensitive reports were coming from the center of America's atomic weapons complex. On March 22, 1949, officials gathered in New Mexico for a conference on aerial phenomena connected to reports around Los Alamos. The document is now listed in Pursuit as a Department of Energy record. The setting matters. Los Alamos was not a random town on a UFO map. It was one of the most sensitive nuclear sites in the United States, and reports of unusual green fireballs in the region were being discussed inside the national security system. This is exactly where source discipline becomes useful. The primary record establishes that officials held a conference and treated the reports as worthy of attention. It does not by itself identify what produced the lights. The record preserves the problem, not a final answer. That is a recurring feature of government UFO files. The most valuable fact may be administrative. Who received the report? Which office thought it mattered? What did investigators request next? Those questions tell us what the government knew at the time, without turning every unknown into a conclusion. Project Sign shows the same pattern at a larger scale. A 1948 progress report, re-released through Pursuit in 2026, documents an organized Air Force effort to collect and evaluate sightings from multiple locations. The National Archives history of the program places Sign inside Air Materiel Command's technical intelligence structure. This was an intelligence problem before it became a pop culture genre. Scene by scene, the system was trying to build a method. A report that seemed impressive on first reading could weaken when astronomical data matched the time and direction. Another could remain open because the witness was credible, but the event had no photograph, no radar record, and no second observer. The process was less about proving or disproving UFOs as a category than about reducing individual cases. The system was trying to build a method. Investigators compared witness reliability, apparent motion, weather, known aircraft, celestial objects, balloons, and intelligence on foreign capabilities. The project itself was renamed Grudge in February 1949. It was reactivated in 1951 and redesignated Project Blue Book in March 1952. Blue Book then became the best-known phase of the government's public UFO investigation, but its logic came directly from the same intelligence problem Sign had faced. Turn incomplete observations into defensible classifications. The important point is not that early investigators were gullible or that they had secretly solved the mystery. They were working with a data environment that imposed hard limits. A trained observer could give a detailed description but still have no reliable range to the object. Without range, size becomes uncertain. Without size, speed becomes uncertain. Without calibrated imagery, a bright light crossing the sky can look more dramatic on paper than the underlying motion actually was. That limitation would become even more important in the next decade, because the United States began flying aircraft at altitudes and speeds ordinary observers had almost never seen. Some of the most convincing UFO reports of the Cold War were created by real machines. The people reporting them were not necessarily wrong about seeing something unusual. They were simply not allowed to know what it was. The U-2 changed the UFO problem because it changed what people could see in the sky without changing what they were allowed to know. The U-2 program was tested from the remote Nevada site that became famous as Area 51. The location was chosen so the CIA, Air Force, and Lockheed could test a reconnaissance aircraft away from ordinary traffic and public view. The secrecy was part of the aircraft's operational value, and that same secrecy guaranteed that many observers would have no conventional category for what they saw. The CIA and Air Force tested and operated the U-2 at extreme altitude during a period when most commercial and military aircraft flew far lower. At sunset, an aircraft high above the observer could still catch sunlight after the ground below had entered darkness. To someone with no reason to imagine a classified reconnaissance plane operating at that altitude, a bright object moving in an unfamiliar way could be reported honestly as unidentified. Then came Oxcart, the CIA program that produced the A-12. The aircraft pushed the mismatch even further. CIA historical material describes the A-12 as capable of sustained Mach 3.2 flight at about 90,000 feet. That combination of altitude, speed, unusual shape, and secrecy made it exactly the kind of real object that could generate an extraordinary report from a ground observer or another pilot who lacked context. The CIA now openly acknowledges the connection between these programs and UFO reporting. Its own historical material says UG-2 and later Oxcart flights accounted for more than half of all UFO reports during the late 1950s and much of the 1960s. That statistic changes how the archive should be read. A large number of reports were not invented. They were observations of something genuinely outside the witness's normal experience. The error entered later when an unknown object was interpreted as evidence of an unknown technology rather than a classified one. Secrecy made the effect stronger. An investigator might suspect a sensitive aircraft but be unable to disclose it in a public explanation. A witness could then receive an answer that sounded evasive or incomplete. From the outside, that gap looked like concealment of the UFO. From inside the classified system, the government was often concealing the aircraft. This is one of the clearest examples of the documentary timeline changing with technology. In 1947, the central problem was how to process visual reports. By the late 1950s, the government itself was creating machines capable of producing extraordinary visual reports. And that mechanism did not end with the U-2. Secret aircraft, high-altitude balloons, missile tests, satellites, re-entry events, drones, and new sensor systems all introduced unfamiliar signatures into the sky. Every new technology creates a period when observers have old categories but new phenomena. During that gap, honest reporting can increase at the same moment. Government secrecy prevents a complete public explanation. The result looks paradoxical only if we assume every unidentified report should have been identifiable to the witness in real time. That does not explain every UFO report. It explains why the category can never be treated as a single phenomenon. A file can describe a metallic object, a light, a formation, a radar return, a photograph, or a pilot encounter. The label tells you only that identification failed at some stage. It does not tell you why. By the 1950s, investigators were hoping cameras and film would solve that problem. Instead, they discovered another rule that still governs UAP analysis today. An image can add evidence while still leaving the most important variables unknown. Project Blue Book accumulated far more than typed witness statements. The National Archives preserves motion picture film, photographs, sound recordings, administrative files, and thousands of individual case records. Its Federal Records Guide describes 20 reels of motion picture material and roughly 8,360 photographs connected to alleged UFO sightings. The Blue Book textual collection was later made available on 94 rolls of microfilm. Parsi has also re-released Project Blue Book Special Report Number 14, an Air Force-era statistical analysis of unidentified aerial object reports, which shows how early investigators were already trying to move beyond anecdotes and compare case characteristics across a larger sample. That sounds like an enormous visual data set. It is, but quantity does not solve geometry. Suppose a film shows a bright object crossing the frame. A viewer can measure pixels immediately, but pixels are angular informations until scale enters the problem. To calculate physical speed, an analyst may need the object's distance, the camera's field of view, the platform's motion, the viewing angle, and reliable timing. If several of those values are missing, the image can establish that something appeared on film without establishing what that something was doing in three-dimensional space. A nearby small object and a distant large object can trace similar paths across the same frame. Camera panning can make a slow target appear fast. Glare can make a point source look larger than the physical object producing it. This is why old UFO photographs often produce arguments that last longer than the exposures themselves. One side sees an authentic government-held image and treats authenticity as proof of an extraordinary object. The other side sees ambiguity and treats ambiguity as proof of a mundane explanation. The file supports neither shortcut. Project Blue Book closed in 1969. The Air Force's published fact sheet says 12,618 sightings had been reported from 1,947 through the end of the program, with 701 left unidentified. Its official conclusion was that the investigations had found no evidence that the unidentified cases represented extraterrestrial vehicles, no indication that they threatened national security, and no evidence beyond then current scientific knowledge. That conclusion did not make the 701 cases disappear. It defined the agency's judgment about what the unresolved remainder established. The distinction is subtle but essential. A case can remain unidentified because the evidence is too weak to support any confident answer. That is different from a case containing strong evidence for a specific extraordinary answer. The lesson was not that photography was useless. It was that images need context. Photography did improve the record. Film preserved motion that a witness might remember incorrectly. Multiple frames allowed analysts to compare trajectories. Better lenses and calibrated systems could add scale. But every improvement also revealed how much context earlier evidence had been missing. The same pattern followed the government into the space age. Cameras moved from the ground into aircraft and spacecraft. Astronaut transcripts, mission photography, and orbital video created an entirely new class of strange-looking material. The question changed again. Instead of asking only what crossed the skies, analysts now had to ask what can look strange when the camera itself is moving through space. Persh makes that transition visible in a way older UFO collections rarely did. The 2026 archive includes NASA material from Apollo 17, a 1,972 mission transcript, 110,973 science and technical crew debriefings, a December 1,972 audio excerpt, and an image cataloged as a UAP-related record. The release sequence in itself is revealing because pieces of the same mission appear across different pursuit tranches rather than arriving as one packaged claim. Later releases also include 3 images from the 1996 SSTS-80 space shuttle mission showing unidentified objects in low Earth orbit. The archive preserves them as records to examine, not as captions that settle origin. The presence of those records in a UAP archive proves provenance. NASA produced the underlying mission material, and the government selected it for release in a collection about unresolved or historically relevant UAP records. That does not automatically validate every interpretation later attached to this image. Space is a hostile environment for visual intuition. A small piece of debris close to a camera can appear large. Ice particles can catch sunlight. Reflections can change rapidly as a spacecraft rotates. A distant object with no scale reference can resist identification even when the image itself is perfectly authentic. NASA's 2023 independent study was not a retroactive verdict on every astronaut photograph. Its value here is methodological. It asked what data the agency could collect in the future, how reporting could be standardized, and how scientific tools might reduce ambiguity. That is why NASA's own modern UAP position is useful. Its independent study, published in 2023, emphasized data quality and standardized collection. NASA's public FAQ says there are no data supporting the idea that UAP are evidence of alien technologies, and notes that most sightings contain too little information for firm scientific conclusions. The space age files therefore sharpen the central rule of this timeline. Better cameras do not eliminate ambiguity automatically. They move the ambiguity into different variables. A typed 1950 report might lack a reliable distance estimate. A 1970s mission photograph might preserve the image but not enough context to determine scale. A modern infrared clip might provide frame-by-frame motion while still hiding or omitting range, field of view, platform velocity, or other sensor metadata. That last problem has become especially important in the modern military era. Infrared systems can detect objects human eyes would miss. Radar can establish tracks. Multiple sensors can sometimes corroborate one event. But sensor footage is not self-explanatory. A display is a measurement system with geometry, software, filtering, and limits. The strongest modern cases are therefore not simply the clearest-looking videos. They are the cases with the richest chain of data, calibrated sensor parameters, platform position, range, timing, weather, independent tracks, and a preserved investigative history. When those pieces exist, cases that once looked extraordinary can collapse into ordinary explanations. When they do not, the file may remain open even after the government has hours of video. Duration is not the same as information density. 10 minutes of an uncalibrated dot can contain less usable evidence than 10 seconds of a target with known range, platform position, and independent radar correlation. In 2023, a U.S. military infrared sensor in Europe recorded 25 seconds of objects moving together. At first glance, the footage belonged to the same modern category that has driven so much UAP attention. Military platform, infrared image, objects visible as heat signatures, official chain of custody. AARO later resolved the case as birds with greater than 95% confidence. Analysts cited the object's morphology, their relative positioning in flight, and a pulsating infrared return consistent with wing beats. The technology that made the objects look mysterious also carried information that helped identify them. That is the modern shift. Military sensors create evidence that can be more precise than a witness statement, but they also create new forms of misinterpretation. Infrared contrast is not a photograph in ordinary visible light. Apparent motion can be affected by the observing platform. Tracking boxes, zoom changes, glare, parallax, image processing, and missing telemetry can all change what a viewer thinks the object is doing. AARO's current public imagery library makes this visible because it places resolved and unresolved cases side by side. One Middle East case from 2024 contains 6 minutes and 42 seconds of infrared footage, yet AARO says the absence of corroborating telemetry or multimodal sensor data prevents a conclusive evaluation of whether the thermal contrast represents a physical source or an artifact. Long video, limited answer. Several European cases from 2022 were resolved as balloons. An African case was resolved as migratory birds. Other clips remain unresolved because the available data cannot establish whether a heat signature came from a physical object, a reflection, an environmental temperature difference, or a sensor artifact. The numbers from AARO's fiscal year 2025 report are even more revealing. As of May 30, 2025, AARO's holdings contained 1,870 reports. For the fiscal year 2025 reporting period, the office received 319 UAP reports and resolved 114 of them. It also resolved 256 old cases for 370 resolutions during the reporting period. A new three-dimensional modeling capability helped analysts resolve 238 reports as satellite flaring across current and older holdings. The method uses viewing geometry rather than appearance alone, matching what an observer reported against where satellites were and how reflected sunlight could reach the observer. Satellite flares are a perfect example of why the explanation changes with the technology. Large satellite constellations create bright points that can appear, intensify, fade, and move in ways that pilots did not encounter at the same scale decades ago. It says, these reports often describe bright orbs at high altitude. Once analysts model the viewing geometry and satellite position, many stop being mysterious. But not all of them. Some modern files still lack the sensor metadata needed for a confident conclusion. Others contain witness descriptions with little technical corroboration. A few merit deeper scientific and intelligence analysis. The result is a record that is simultaneously better and more complicated than Project Blue Book. Modern investigators confuse imagery, signals, human reporting, measurement data, weather, platform information, and three-dimensional models. But if one essential variable was never recorded, no amount of later confidence can recreate it from nothing. We have more sensors, more data, and better tools. We also have more objects in the sky, more classified systems, more drones, more satellites, and more ways for a real sensor to record something that cannot be identified from the surviving data alone. This is where the word unresolved causes the most confusion. In the Pursuit Archive, the Department of War says the released unresolved cases are records for which the government cannot make a definitive determination about the observed phenomenon. It explicitly notes that insufficient data can be the reason. That definition is narrower than the public meaning often attached to the word. AARO's fiscal year 2025 report makes the categories even clearer. Of the 319 reports received in the covered period, 191 were moved to an active archive while analysts waited for possible corroborating data. Those cases did not contain enough information to decide whether the underlying event matched natural phenomena or exceeded known technology. 9 reports were identified as meriting further analysis by intelligence and science and technology partners. That is less than 3% of the 319 reports received in that period, while the much larger active archive mainly reflects insufficient evidence rather than a positive finding of anomalous performance. Those are very different statements. An active archive case may be open because the evidence is incomplete. A case merits further analysis has enough substance to justify additional work. A resolved case has a confident attribution. A case closed as not anomalous can remain unidentified in a narrow sense while showing no performance that warrants deeper analysis. The report draws another boundary. ARO received 50 unmanned aerial system reports near U.S. nuclear sites, but says none were reported as UAP. Sensitive location alone does not create a UFO case. This vocabulary prevents a common statistical trick, taking every file that lacks a final identification and treating the entire remainder as evidence of one exotic cause. The authorized disclosure channel applies the same filter to claims about secret programs. Between June 2024 and May 2025, 262 people contacted AARO. The office judged 255 out of scope and found 7 whose claims warranted follow-up. An official interview confirms that an allegation was collected. It does not validate the allegation by itself. The government's own modern record does not support that move. The FY25 report says all cases resolved during the reporting period were attributed to prosaic objects or events including balloons, birds, satellites, aircraft, unmanned aerial systems, a commercial rocket launch, and a manned jetpack. It also says none of the resolved cases indicated breakthrough foreign technology. At the same time, AARO does not claim that every open case has been explained. It says missing timely sensor data continues to limit resolution. That is a less cinematic answer, but it is a stronger one. Unresolved is a status of the evidence, and once that rule is applied consistently, the 75-year archive stops looking like one continuous alien mystery. It becomes a history of observation under changing technical conditions. Witnesses before calibrated sensors, secret aircraft before public disclosure, film before telemetry, orbital imagery before modern contexts, and infrared systems that can reveal both extraordinary-looking signatures and very ordinary birds. The remaining cases are worth studying precisely because the unresolved category has been cleaned of meanings it never contained. In 2026, that entire history was pulled into a new public system. Pursues opened with Release 01 on May 8th, followed by releases on May 22nd, June 12, July 10, and August 7. The 5th release was confirmed by the Department of War as another tranche of declassified and historical UAP files, with more releases planned on a rolling basis. On the public portal, Release 05 alone is offered as roughly 130 megabytes of documents, 513 megabytes of video, while earlier tranches include gigabytes of material obstacle. Classification, metadata, context, and analysis are. The initial May release was explicitly interagency, involving the Department of War, AARO, ODNI, NASA, FBI, the Department of Energy, and other intelligence components. That broad provenance is unusual compared with the older model in which researchers had to assemble separate agency collections themselves. The archive does something important even when it does not solve a case. It places old Air Force records, intelligence documents, NASA mission material, FBI interviews, modern military sensor videos, and later analysis in one searchable chain. That makes it harder to blur the difference between a witness claim and an agency conclusion. A file can be genuine while the statement inside it remains unverified. An image can be official while its interpretation stays uncertain. A case can be unresolved because the object is extraordinary or because the surviving data is inadequate. The record alone does not let us skip that distinction. After 75 years, the pattern is not a straight march toward one answer. It is a record of changing error bars. Each generation created better instruments, then discovered new ways those instruments could confuse us. The strongest lesson in the files is methodological. Preserve the report, preserve the metadata, separate observation from interpretation, and let later evidence change the conclusion when it deserves to. That is what Unsealed Sky will keep doing. Subscribe if you want the file before the folklore, because the next case is exactly where this discipline matters. One newly released FBI interview describes an object so large it appeared to black out the stars. The interview is a real government file. The object inside it is still, at that stage of the record, a witness claim. And that difference is where the next investigation begins.